Currency is power, not wealth, not capital, not even money. Power. Because whoever defines currency, what it is, how it's created, when and where it moves, defines the boundaries of freedom, the limits of assignment, and the illusion of choice. For centuries, value was tangible: land, grain, metal. Then came fiat, value by decree, backed by nothing but the promise of men in suits and the threat of consequences. Now, in a world tilting towards surveillance and control, where the idea of money itself is becoming programmable, we face a stark question. What even is value? What makes something worth anything? Is it scarcity, trust, use, narrative? This episode isn't just about Bitcoin. It's about what comes after fiat. It's about the war being fought, not with tanks, but ledgers. Not over territory, but over transaction. And it's about the builders who are quietly laying the foundations for a parallel economy. One that might not ask for permission. My guest today, Allan Farrington, is one of those builders, an investor, not in Bitcoin, the asset, but the businesses springing up around it, the infrastructure of a post-fiat world. A world where value flows peer-to-peer, not top-down. But if money is no longer backed by governments and no longer trusted by people, then what, if anything, is it backed by at all? That is where we begin. Welcome to Map to the Future.
Sounds good.
Fantastic. So without further ado, like, tell everyone about yourself.
Sure. So, my name's Allan Farrington. I am the co-founder and general partner of a firm called Axiom, whose logo you correctly identified before. We're a venture capital firm that focuses on investing in the Bitcoin ecosystem. It can be a little bit more precise about that because it's fairly open-ended. The kind of companies that we like investing in are not ones that simply have Bitcoin on their balance sheet, for example, is becoming very popular at the moment. Or in the sense that is their only connection to Bitcoin, is that they, happen to own some and they stand to benefit from its appreciation. We're much more kind of classically VC oriented in the sense that we want to be investing in technology companies. So we want to invest in companies that are we use the expression building on Bitcoin quite a lot, that are, we use the expression or the word infrastructure quite a lot too, that are building something that extends the utility of Bitcoin and ultimately offers some good or some service that either wouldn't be possible without Bitcoin or would be much more expensive. And that still captures a pretty wide range. I can go into a bit more detail about the verticals that we expect to see opportunities in, if you like. Probably fintech would be most relevant to this conversation.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that what interests me is that you go back 20 years and nobody would have ever put any credence in there being a digital currency. Everyone would have said to you, that's mad. That's just never going to happen. And yet here we are. And there's not just a digital currency, there's thousands of them. And from the conversations I've had previously with yourself, you're of the opinion that only really Bitcoin has got any real value to it in real terms. So and I think that from conversations we've had previously, I kind of understood that as the way Bitcoin has been formulated is the kind of the only way to do it properly as far as a digital currency goes, and the others are kind of doing it differently.
I think there's some interesting nuance there. I'm mindful of going down a massive rabbit hole just on what's good and bad about Bitcoin, and we never move on to anything else. But to summarize the argument, around, Bitcoin versus other cryptocurrencies. So in my introduction, I said, not just me, but Axiom, we're focused on Bitcoin. We don't look at other cryptocurrencies. The kind of conversations that we've had, the kind of content you'll have heard from me, I think I can communicate this relatively concisely. I could spend an hour, but I'll try to do it in sentences. And it really boils down to Bitcoin having been the first. Almost everything is derivative of Bitcoin having been the first.
Right.
Insofar as for any alternative cryptocurrency to hope to compete with Bitcoin, we've seen this now for over 10 years. They almost all follow exactly the same playbook. In order to try to catch up with the lead that Bitcoin has, invariably what they have to do is basically have a kind of a centralized team, almost like a founding team in the sense of a startup. A lot of the time it's even communicated that way in terms of, it having a founder. And the point there being that gives them the resources and the ability to coordinate to market the project such that people will even find out about it in the first place and hear why it's potentially better than Bitcoin.
Okay.
So far, so good. That maybe sounds pretty straightforward. It certainly is entirely straightforward in a startup context. The problem here is that Bitcoin itself has no founder. It has no central coordination. It at no point did it reward any insiders, which is another kind of byproduct of this typical playbook for crypto. And that's actually critical to how it works. I'll dance around the technicalities here, but I'm sure the audience will be vaguely familiar with the idea of Bitcoin being decentralized, right?
Yes.
Whereas what I've just described with these other projects is pretty fundamental centralization from the outset as well. So the argument is basically that no matter how well-intentioned they are, because I think some of them are pretty well-intentioned, some of them are pretty obviously scams, and then there's a whole spectrum in between.
Yeah.
Almost no matter how well-intentioned they are, this is like their original sin in a sense. They can never overcome this fatal founding flaw. And so that's why we're basically just not all that interested in them. The other point I did want to come back to briefly, though, is I don't know how sort of seriously you meant this, or if you were just setting up the question, but the idea of Bitcoin being like the perfect design, I don't think that's true at all. I don't think really anybody who's interested in Bitcoin thinks that's true either, because it's constantly changing. There's really interesting discussion to be had there about, how it's changing, why it's changing, what it might be changing into. But even purely, I mean, just be clear, not how it's received more broadly, not how people think about it, how it works technically has constantly been changing since its initiation. And so I don't think there's any, the reason to favor Bitcoin over others, I don't think, I'm pretty sure I've never come across this, at least from anybody who knows what they're talking about, isn't this is the perfect design and they're all terrible. It's really the first point. It's really more just they're terrible. It's like, this isn't perfect, but they're definitely worse.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I see. Yes. Yeah. That makes sense. So is your opinion and your expectation that over the course of the next few decades, fiat currency is going to become less and less and less fungible, and that there is going to be a far more substantial uptake of cryptocurrencies in general? And let's for the time being leave aside the central bank digital currency ideas and just talk about the peer-to-peer stuff. What's your feeling on that?
So I'm glad you said over the coming decades, because I feel like that's a suitably long time horizon to not have to completely caveat everything. Because normally I would be, or more often, let's say, I would be asked, price predictions or something like that over the next year or 2 years or 5 years. And I just have absolutely no idea. I think anybody who's being honest with themselves just has to say that almost the more they, like Bitcoin, whatever that even means, however that manifests, the longer they've been in the space, the more kind of a stake they have, the more they ought to just be honest and say they frankly have no idea.
Yes.
However, over decades and decades, I'm more so, I guess implicitly that's like 10 to 50 or 10 to 90 years or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm a lot more comfortable saying that I wouldn't say it's 100%, but it's very, very likely. It gets more likely over longer and longer periods that in the most boring sense, or the most boring kind of detail of all of it, the price of Bitcoin will almost certainly continue to go up. The reason being that more and more people are realizing how much more effective it is, primarily as a store of value. But typically, once having realized that, they then kind of tiptoe into other functions of money that it simply performs better than fiat currencies. And I don't see any reason for either the pace of adoption via that means of introduction to slow down. Probably the more pertinent point, though, this is something I'm not sure if you're even aware of this, Alex, but I've kind of crafted this kind of meme for myself within Bitcoin circles, where I'll say something like, I don't even like Bitcoin that much, I just hate fiat. And I'll tease out what I actually mean by that. I think it comes back to your question in a less memey, sort of more helpful, hopefully fairly interesting way. Most of what I just described around Bitcoin adoption, I think we're actually at this point already. I think that the current wave of Bitcoin adoption is less about people coming to Bitcoin and more about them fleeing fiat.
Yeah.
And so tying that together with the meme of, oh, I just hate fiat, and I guess Bitcoin will do in that case. Fiat is structured in such a way that I see its perpetual inflation as essentially inevitable. We will never escape. You could call it boom and bust credit cycles inherent in fiat. And I realize I've covered a whole bunch here. I'll stop and see where you want to go next. But final detail to mention, I think it's really important in having these discussions. You mentioned Bitcoin you said 20 years ago we wouldn't have had any notion of any of this, which I more or less agree with, because Bitcoin is now 16 years old, so we're coming up on 20. So obviously it's pretty new in the scheme of things, right? Fiat is also very, very new. I think most people don't really appreciate this, certainly not in the context of comparing it to Bitcoin. The monetary system that we have today, more or less, other than various details around kind of digital payments, so things like credit cards and how banks actually move money between them, the actual foundations of it was more or less solidified in 1971.
Yeah.
And so we're only a little over 50 years into what you might call the fiat experiment. That's what, in terms of the rhetoric around this, I think is more helpful to compare Bitcoin to that. There's almost a romantic way that you could frame it, which again, a lot of Bitcoiners do, which is it's the fiat experiment that's new and horrible and awful, and Bitcoin is a return to what had always worked before this.
Right.
In this podcast, we will attempt to map the future. We will discuss, debate, and at times boldly postulate about how the world ahead may look. We'll explore a myriad of topics, from the interesting, the unknown, to the sublime. Because in order to understand where we're going, we must first understand what we will be. We will delve into history, philosophy, religion, art, politics, good, evil, and all the gaps between them. We will attempt to create a picture, a compass of the many possible futures that lie ahead. I won't promise we'll always be right, but I will promise this: we will seek the truth above all else, and we will remain steadfast in our mission to do so. The more we understand about how the future is being shaped, the greater our chance of moulding it into one we actually desire. This is where we boldly go, where no one has yet been. This is where we attempt to set the course. This is Back to the Future.
Okay, that's an interesting. That's interesting, because obviously I'm aware that the fiat thing, as you mentioned, is quite new, and obviously that then I think took another turn when there was an abandonment of the gold standard that sat underneath it for a while. And I think both of those two things, I think you're right in as much as both of those two things have effectively put fiat on a path of no return. It probably can't ever get back to what that was without there being a new system in place. What I am interested in there, one of the things you mentioned just then, which I'm interested in exploring in general, but let's start off with Bitcoin itself. You mentioned it as a store of value. So in my opinion, and in the opinion of other people and economists I've read and so on, value in anything, it comes down to trust. It doesn't really come down to anything else at all. It's if someone trusts that a thing has value, they will take it as a payment if they believe that it has value in it. Whereas if they don't believe it has value in it, despite what it may or may not have as an intrinsic value, people won't use it. So I suppose the question therefore is, what in your opinion gives Bitcoin that intrinsic value and the value store? And then how does that translate into wider wider monetary exchange in the future?
Yeah. I make a slight clarification to your point. I mostly agree with that, but I'd specify it as value in a candidate money, not just value in general. I think there's a worthwhile difference there, just in terms of how you would rigorously define value in basically any other good, and hence why money is interestingly different. But yeah, it basically does just come down to trust. I mean, you could put it in almost even more layman's terms of, it comes down to this kind of weird reciprocal belief that other people will share the same belief as you. So you're kind of having to always think like, well, what will he think? But also, what will he think about what I think? And so on and so forth. And so it's
faith, I suppose, is the word, isn't it?
Sorry?
Faith, I suppose, is the word, isn't it? It's
because I was just thinking there, if I'm not even sure I do agree with trust, because trust almost suggests, not to get too philosophical about this, but you trust people, right? Like when you have trust, it's in, I guess, ultimately somebody's character, whereas this is somehow more, or it's just different to that. It's not really about people. I mean, maybe actually, here's an interesting link. You could conceive of it as being in institutions, and which is, I guess a little bit of an abstraction of the people involved in them.
Yes.
And what's really interesting about Bitcoin is that this is, I think, is getting to the heart of your question. You really don't need any trust in any institutions with Bitcoin. You absolutely do with fiat. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, I would say this, I would be a bit, I would begrudgingly admit that I think most kind of normal people don't really understand this, or haven't been forced to understand it yet. The institutions that they have to trust for fiat are deeply untrustworthy, and they shouldn't.
Yes.
And so it's basically that it's that realization dawning that, on the one hand, they shouldn't be trusting the fiat institutions. On the other, Bitcoin is, well, you wouldn't even say trustworthy anymore. That's the point I'll get to in a second. That is super interesting, but that is basically just, it doesn't have these flaws, let's say. And then there's a transition of people over. And so, okay, then you ask, well, if you don't trust Bitcoin, like, why would you trust Bitcoin in the first place? And then what's my weird nuance about how I want to use the word trust? So, for Bitcoin itself, the answer, this sounds, I'm aware that this sounds weird to people who are coming to it for the first time. It sounds a little bit circular, but feel free to probe, obviously, if you want to go a bit deeper, that it's ultimately down to it being free and open source software. So in more economic terms, there's a cap on the supply. That's really pretty fundamental to the value, right?
Yeah.
We know exactly how much Bitcoin there will ever be in circulation. And you can dig into, via the fact that it runs fundamentally on free and open source software. There's literally no institution involved in its issuance or its circulation or whatever. Anybody can dig into how this software works and convince themselves of the relevant incentives that keep it going in this decentralized way. So that's right back to the point I was mentioning relative to other cryptocurrencies, that because they lack that decentralization, you almost invariably are actually trusting some or other institution, which is typically just the founders and their quasi company. So with Bitcoin, it's being able to almost audit, in some sense. People like using that word kind of jokingly in comparison to how, the Fed never gets audited, right?
Yes.
You can audit the way it works and convince yourself of exactly how it works and how it will always work, completely absent any politics. And there's a really handy little slogan, or like piece of rhetoric that I really like, that every Bitcoiner is familiar with this. And I think it has a kind of a literal meaning, but it almost goes beyond that as like a political slogan, which is "Don't trust, verify." So I'm actually really glad that we introduced all of this language, because that's sort of where my mind was going in terms of thinking, well, you don't really trust Bitcoin. What do you? Well, you verify. That's what you do.
Yeah.
You look at the code. You look at what's being produced by the node that you're running. And yeah, it's just a completely different paradigm for how it works as a system, and as a result it's a different mindset that's instilled in the people using it.
Yes, yes. I suppose that therefore to me immediately begs the question, how does the average person do that? Because let's take an example. My dad, he's in his 70s. He's got zero trust in anything on a computer,
He's had enough.
of almost anything at all. And if we were to say to him, look, you can use Bitcoin and you can go verify it himself, he would have zero chance of even understanding how he could do that. So I suppose the question,
that's a really good question.
Yeah,
so
how does that work?
This is something that I think, unfortunately, a lot of Bitcoiners shy away from. And I think the reason is that they're disproportionately likely to be technical, both in general and also technical enough to do the verification themselves and not have to trust.
Yes.
And so I think it's something I've thought about. I'm not claiming to be an expert in this by any means. It's just kind of an interesting feature of all of this, but it's something that I've thought about as kind of understudied, almost because it's like a little bit embarrassing. But my theory on it is roughly as follows: that I think it goes well beyond Bitcoin. I think it's really a point about, again, free and open source software, that the way that I can explain in a bit more detail what that means. I don't know if your audience will know necessarily, but the way that works, like what it means for something to be free and open source software, doesn't require, really in any case, it doesn't require that absolutely everybody using it has mastered it, right? It merely requires that in theory they could. And so this is really more down to incentives again.
Yes.
In the sense that if you're looking at some piece of software that is truly free and open source, if you are not technically capable of verifying, right, of doing this audit yourself, you can get some reassurance. And admittedly, it is kind of creeping into trust, but it's trust. It's not blind trust. It's very well grounded trust in the idea that there are many, many people out there who are capable of verifying it. They have, and they're happy. And they haven't reported any perverse incentives that are coming out of this. And it seems to be working, and they're not ringing the alarm. I obviously, I'm trying to be very careful in how I word this, because I don't have a kind of it's not like don't trust, verify. I don't have any good standard slogans around this, because it's not something that I think is routinely addressed. But I do find it very, very reassuring. And for example, this is again almost a perfect comparison to other cryptocurrencies. If it weren't free and open, I mean, actually, no, they are typically free and open source. They have other issues, but just for the sake of argument, if it wasn't free and open source, if it was software that I don't have the technical competency to verify, but actually no one else I trust does either, and it's just coming from some company. So, perfect example of this. This is a while ago, but I don't know if you remember. In something like 2019, Facebook led or Meta, I guess, I don't remember if they changed their name to Meta then, like the company led this project called Libra. Does this ring a bell?
It does, yes. This was pre-Meta, I think.
That I'm not sure if they were even calling it a stablecoin then, because that hadn't become as much of a meme as it is now. It was just like it was a cryptocurrency, right? But it was spearheaded by Facebook, and they had a whole bunch of other massive corporations involved in their governance or whatever. I forget exactly how they were describing all of it, because basically none of it made sense, and it did eventually just fall apart.
I remember.
But arguably the key reason for this was this unraveling of the incentives around it being closed, right? Yes. There was no way for the proposed hypothetical individual users of this to really verify anything or to trust that anybody had verified it other than Facebook. So that's why that didn't work. And the complete opposite of all of that is why Bitcoin does work.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so here's an extrapolation then. So let's look at it from there. So obviously one of the things you've mentioned, which I think most people probably aren't aware of, is that there's a finite amount of Bitcoin ever. There will never be over a certain amount of Bitcoin. Now, the immediate thing that jumps to mind for somebody who doesn't understand it is that, well, so if there's only so many, then only so many people can have any. Because if you buy a Bitcoin there, and let's say for sake of argument, there's only ever going to be 1 million Bitcoins, then you can only ever have 1 million people owning a Bitcoin. But however, they break them down, they fractionalize them, and people own 0.001% of a Bitcoin and so on. So from that point of view, with the value moving in the direction that it's moving, which over time has only ever gone up from the very start, even though there's been peaks and troughs on the way, if you'd simply bought Bitcoin at the beginning and held on to it, you'd be well up on where you are, on where you began. Would the supply be capable of dealing with the entire world's economy?
I'm pretty sure, yes. I don't know the exact numbers for this off the top of my head, but as you mentioned, what people think of as one Bitcoin is really it depends exactly how there's some kind of controversy around the definitions here, but it can this is an uncontroversial way of putting it. It can be subdivided into 100 million units. So there's this meme around how there'll only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Really, there will only ever be, what is it, 2.1 quadrillion sats is the term for the smallest unit. And I don't think anybody's ever raised a concern that that's not enough. It's almost an unfathomably large amount. So it's, you can imagine it's like we're pricing things, and I have no idea if the order of magnitude is even right here, but just to kind of push in the right direction at least. It's like pricing things in hundredths of a penny. Like you're going to be fine. You're not going to run out. You had a second question though.
So that was the first one. Is just making sure that we're kind of covering that point off. In that you could technically have the commerce of the entire world run on it effectively, potentially, because you've got that subdivision.
There's no concern from the value of the lowest denomination from that.
Yeah, exactly.
That'll be fine.
Okay, and which leads me on to, I think, the most important point around the entire idea of decentralized currency is, at what point do we think that governments attempt to prevent it from becoming the main form of transaction? Because
that's a really good question.
Because obviously the banking system in reality is an extension of government. And if you're cutting both of those two things out for transactions, they're not going to be happy about that. And so hence why they're talking about central bank digital currencies, which are effectively what you get on your bank statement now. It's it's not a real currency. It's not backed by anything. It's a fiat, but it's literally numbers on a screen. There's nothing more really to it than that. But that is all controlled by central governments, central banks, and the banking system. So what is your take on that? What is your feeling on that?
This is a great question. I think there's quite a few threads that we've covered. I can tie together here. So probably the most important one is, yet again, it's kind of derivative of the price. I think, just being honest, that I have no idea exactly how. I don't think anyone knows exactly how it's going to play out, or even roughly how it's going to play out. I have some ideas, but they're very lightly held. And worth noting, it's already been banned many times in many places, and that doesn't really seem to have had any effect. Not to say that we should be complacent about that. There could be a much more coordinated effort in the future that has a higher likelihood of actually having a material effect in denting usage and probably hitting the price a bit as well. But I think there's a couple of reasons to be reassured that such an effort couldn't ever work. Not that it won't be tried. It'll be tried over and over again forever, probably.
Yes.
But it wouldn't work. So by far the most important, I think, is just back to this point about decentralization. And I realize we haven't really defined that it's probably not worth it for the point of this conversation, but there's copious resources people can find in terms of nailing down technically what this means.
Yes.
Insofar as in the context of resistance to state capture, can give a little bit more detail about what it means, which is basically that to the extent it forms a network, this network is global, has, the last I checked, I think tens of thousands of participants, but you would expect that to go up. Like that number also always goes up. Most of whom are anonymous. And so in order to in order for such a coordinated attack to have any chance of working, you need to find out who all of these people are and forcibly shut down basically their computers.
Right. Yeah.
There's a bit more, not a bit more. There's a lot more detail you can go into there.
Yes.
But you have a sense of like, it's not, as opposed to telling Facebook, no, you can't do that.
Yeah,
right? It's very easy, right?
Yes, it's one company, one organization, and that's it. Whereas
if anybody's a bit more, any in the audience is a bit more kind of technically inclined, you could imagine it, just given it is literally an internet protocol, like that is one way of conceiving of its nature. You could imagine such an effort as akin to trying to ban something like Tor, or actually Tor is probably by far the best example. I'm trying to think of other like historic cases of there's the one, I'm completely blanking on what it's called, but the basically the evolution of Napster, so which is also a great case study.
Wasn't it Pirate Bay? Was that it?
Well, Pirate Bay is still. I'm not sure if it's a for-profit company. It's still an entity, but it's a very good example. I'm just totally blanking on the actual software that I think evolved out of Napster, but then came. I'm done.
Napster's a good example to bring up anyway, because even when they shut down Napster, the fact of the matter is what they couldn't do is go to every single customer that ever purchased something from Napster and and remove all the music they'd ever downloaded, for example. So it's a similar kind of idea. What's it called?
So BitTorrent is also a I guess you would call it a protocol. It's a client software that people use to in a kind of a dry sense share data peer to peer, and in that more commercial sense, like steal music or whatever. But it evolved out of Napster, and I forget the stats on this, but there was at some point, interestingly, I don't go too much of a tangent on this. Interestingly, this has since reversed because of music streaming services basically becoming really, really good. So the fact that most people now just use Apple Music or Spotify or something like that. But at some point, I think around maybe the late noughties, BitTorrent, although nominally illegal in the sense of Napster was shut down and no one, no business could build around BitTorrent. It was something like 20-30% of all internet traffic because you can't stop it. So anyway, I don't want to go further down that tangent. We can rope it back in. If you try to buy Bitcoin, if you try to ban Bitcoin, it's similar to trying to ban BitTorrent, except that people are way more passionate about Bitcoin than they ever were about BitTorrent. There's a lot more money on the line, and there's a lot more ideology on the line than BitTorrent. So it probably won't work. That was the main point to come back.
I think that's interesting. I mean, I think for my impression of Bitcoin is that it's still predominantly seen as this kind of newfangled idea. Most people still don't fully understand it. Most people still don't have any real clue what they can do it. And I think it's interesting. We can talk about Musket and other companies like that at some point, but I think it's interesting that there is now an infrastructure starting to build where people can use it more commercially, because I think the problem with it always was that it was only, if it was just peer to peer. Let's say when I ran my previous company before, which was a digital marketing business, we got offered Bitcoin a couple of times, and and I never took it because at the time I was like, well, I can't buy anything with it. If I if I get given if I get given this Bitcoin, it just sits there, and I have to find someone else I can give Bitcoin to before I can buy anything with it. And so that's what, what's the point of that? And I think digital currency and Bitcoin specifically will become a lot more understood, a lot more trusted, or have a lot more faith in it, if we like, when people can use it to buy their groceries with, for example. And at the moment, we're still not quite at that point with Bitcoin.
No, I completely agree. With the one caveat that it depends where in the world you're looking. So this is another really important thread in answer to your previous question as to how I think it will evolve, right, and what the responses of various states will be. And there's another thread of mine from way earlier I wanted to bring back, which is that I don't even like Bitcoin, I just hate fiat, right? Which is that I think this is something that even a lot of Bitcoiners, I think, are unfortunately confused about, but it's very difficult to communicate this more broadly because Bitcoin is very often lumped in, insofar as it's technology, right? It's like a new technology. It's lumped in people's minds with basically every other kind of software that you would typically associate with like Silicon Valley, right? So apps on smartphones, maybe occasionally some other kind of desktop or website or whatever, but that kind of model of not only creating but also monetizing software, which is, I think, it's obvious why you would draw some parallels there, but the massive difference is the competitive landscape, I guess, in the sense that Bitcoin is, to my mind, I think this is kind of just true by definition, but Bitcoin is only going to succeed. In fact, it's only even really going to be needed to the extent that its direct competitor in any given geography, or even in the mind of any given potential user, to the extent that its competitor, which is fiat, is failing them.
Right.
So this is something very interesting about how you would expect adoption to work, or not expect. I don't know. Again, I don't want to be overly precise about it when frankly nobody has any idea. But one of the obvious reflections that actually you might have that I think ends up being a bit painful for some Bitcoiners is that for the most part, money works really well in, let's say, US, Western Europe, Japan, right?
Yeah.
The main flaw it has is that it doesn't hold value over time. So it's a very poor store of value, which is why that tends to be the way that people get into Bitcoin, at least in these countries, because it's more of like an intellectual thing that they recognize that they don't in fact expect. Like well, maybe one person ever, I don't know, but I feel like hardly anyone in, say, the UK will ever have bought Bitcoin so as to then go buy groceries with it.
Yeah.
Like, maybe again, back to 10 to 90 years, in decades time, that will be the case. But it certainly isn't the case now. And it's basically because payments actually work really well. And so where I'm going with all of this is just kind of tying up that different people experiencing different competitors to Bitcoin, so different fiat currencies, will likely have very different attitudes to this.
Yes.
And a kind of interesting consequence, I think, is that it's relatively reasonable to expect. I don't know exactly what ratio, like, again, you risk getting spuriously precise about this, but that people in far more like remote countries, let's say, with very weak currencies, with hyperinflating currencies, they will likely get Bitcoin not only intellectually much faster, but start integrating it into their commerce. Personal savings maybe to begin with, but then building up commerce around it. And I think that's the most use, given my my bearishness on the long term of fiat, that eventually they'll all fail, right? So you have somewhere like, I don't know, Turkish lira is failing very fast right now. Relative to the dollar looks good, but the dollar is also going to fail in the long run, right? So with that in mind, seeing how it's adopted, or even just thinking through how it makes sense it would be adopted in places where the competitor is much worse, and hence Bitcoin is much more attractive, I think is useful. And so what I'd expect, like your example, you know, you might buy some, you might think about using it at the grocer. I think the way to expect, there's basically, I guess, two ways to expect more mainstream adoption in the UK, in the US. One, as already mentioned, is essentially as an investment, right? Because this stores value
Yeah.
better than not just any other money, but any other, you know, speculative asset. Which is funny because a lot of detractors will point to this as if it's a bad thing, when in fact it's like amazing. This is you're witnessing it monetizing. So
Yes.
have fun. But then the probably the more interesting one, and then this is where it starts to tip over into, this is really more about fiat failing than it is about Bitcoin succeeding, is when people start people start demanding to be paid in Bitcoin.
Yes.
And that's when I think it'll click for a lot of people, because they'll then, and the reason they would do that is obvious, like they just don't want pounds anymore, right? They don't want dollars, like, or it could be even subtler than that. And there's maybe even a link to Musket here if you want to then use that segue, that it could be that if they got pounds or dollars or whatever, they just buy Bitcoin with it. Like that's the only thing they would do with it. So why even accept it in the first place? Just force people to pay them in Bitcoin. I think when people start realizing how bad fiat is and they start getting into that attitude, that's when you start driving it. That's when commercial use starts to drive. And that's when it really, I can imagine all sorts of ways that this would happen practically, that the first time lots and lots of people will seriously think about Bitcoin, because like everyone is aware of it now, but most people I don't think really thought about it seriously. I think the first time a lot of people will think about it seriously will be because they're in some situation where, you know, either they're trying to buy a good from a merchant, or maybe even they're trying to hire someone, right? They're the employer and they want to make a job offer. And the other side of the trade is saying, I demand to be paid in Bitcoin. I'm not taking your government shitcoin. That's the first time they were like, oh shit, maybe I do need Bitcoin.
Would you like to map your future? Would you like to plot out the way you want your life to go? Would you like to find a way to take yourself from where you are to where you really want to be? If so, now you can. Come book an appointment with me. Use the link at the end of this video or down in the description. And you can book a one-to-one session with me, and together we can start mapping your future. I am an investor, a mentor, an entrepreneur, a business coach, a mindset coach. I have personally taken myself through several transformations in my lifetime and remapped and refocused myself in a new direction several times over. Now I dedicate myself to viewing that future, to mapping the future that the world could have. And I want to help you map your personal one. So come book with me today and let us start mapping your future.
Like maybe I do need it as money, because my money sucks.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point, in that it comes again down to the point we were trying to sort of figure out earlier, the trust and the faith in the existing currency. As they lose trust and lose faith in the existing currencies, they will look for a different currency. And
that's exactly what's happening in that scenario, right there. And I can imagine it being really confusing as well, because you're almost thinking like, wait a minute, I thought you did like this, and I thought you thought that I liked this, and I thought you thought that he thought that, and it's like, wait a minute, what is going on anymore?
No, I think that's interesting, because I think for me as well, one of the things that's always been challenging, and I know people who have talked to me about this, and I must admit I have very, very briefly dabbled in some cryptocurrency buying and so on, but not much. And I think the thing that is potentially difficult for the average person, again, to get their head around is the rapidity of price fluctuation. So for example, if I put £10,000 in my bank account, and then next week and I don't touch it, and then the next week I go back and look, there's still £10,000 in my bank account. Whereas if I buy £10,000 worth of Bitcoin, and I've got £10,000 worth of Bitcoin sitting there, I can go and look at that an hour later, and it's 9,984,
Yeah.
and then I look at it 3 hours later, and it's 10,210, and it shifts around quite dramatically. So although it gradually moves upwards over that time, I think that speed of fluctuation is perhaps difficult for a lot of people to conceptualize and understand, because the first thing you think as the average person is, oh, I've bought £10,000 worth of it. If I looked at it now and it's 9,980, what, I've lost 25 quid or whatever it happens to be. You know, how have I done that? You know, that's the question that I suppose people immediately wonder. So how would you fix that, I suppose, or how would that be differently
I don't think it
worked?
needs to be fixed. I think it's just a very natural reflection of the stage of its monetization. So in the just a minute or two ago, in the immediately previous answer, differentiating between seeing it as essentially an investment, right, versus requiring it for commerce.
Yes.
This is, I'm basically just going to rephrase what you said, but with a totally different perspective.
That's fine.
What people in that situation are saying or are recognizing is that it's a very volatile investment and that they have no need for it in commerce, right? And I think the key thing is that there's another good meme in Bitcoin, this kind of like recurring joke that people bring up, mainly just to tease people when they get too concerned about the volatility, like kind of tease outsiders and, you know, be happy with everybody who's in on the joke. That you put up a price chart of Bitcoin but denominated in Bitcoin, right? And it's just a straight line. It's just one forever, right? One Bitcoin is always worth one Bitcoin. But what that's getting at, though, is that you think it's volatile because you're denominating it in fiat. Now, for most people, I'm not saying that condescendingly, because most people, myself included, for what it's worth, because I live in the UK, almost everything else that you want to buy or sell is denominated in fiat. So it makes sense that you would think of Bitcoin that way. That is because you don't use Bitcoin for commerce. And so tying all of this together, this is actually a really nice insight into why, like, because, you know, I said before, I've kind of crafted this meme for myself that I rarely actually explain. I just assume people understand what I mean by it. But the whole, I don't even like Bitcoin, I just hate fiat. This is the explanation, or part of the explanation of that, I think, in that Bitcoin is only ever going to be as useful as fiat is ceasing to be useful.
Yes.
So while you have that speculative, and well, here's a really interesting point, actually, to tie even those together. And this is something I think a lot of detractors get wrong as well, because they'll identify, you know, the volatility. They'll grudgingly admit, okay, yes, it's gone up 1,000,000% over. It's like, okay, fine, it's the best investment ever, but it's still useless and stupid. It's tulips or whatever. The investment ration, like, insofar as you see it as an investment asset and not as a money that you're using day to day in commerce, any thesis there only makes sense on the basis that it could one day be used in commerce. If you don't anticipate ever using it as money, then nothing you think about why it's going to go up is going to make any sense, because the reason it goes up is purely more people realizing that they also, it's the trust thing again, right? It's just like, he thinks that I think that he thinks, it's that kind of weird dynamic spreading. But it needs an end point, right? And the end point, to my mind, is only ever going to be driven by the extent to which fiat is kind of collapsing. So again, this seems weird and alien in the UK today, like when we're recording this. It's totally normal in a whole range of, you know, I mentioned like Turkey before, until very recently. Argentina was a great case study.
Venezuela's in a similar situation.
I'm not going to list every country that's had a hyperinflation recently, but that attitude that you described of, you know, you put £10,000 in the bank and then it's still £10,000 in a few hours, whereas if it's Bitcoin, who knows what it's going to be. That's exactly the opposite in a whole host of these countries. And as in, you know, if they keep it in their local fiat shitcoin, then they have no idea what it's going to be. It's a terrible plan. If they put it in Bitcoin, they know for sure it will be worth more. And so that, I think, This is
Yeah,
my
I think that makes
on fiat is I think we'll all eventually experience that.
that definitely makes sense, and I think there's I think you're right in that it's most likely going to get adopted in the countries where there's the bigger volatility in in their fiat currencies and so, because at the moment a lot of countries like that use dollars. Most countries that have got really badly operating economies, everyone trades in dollars.
Yep.
And
Which is
I
really
think
encouraging, by the way, just in terms of thinking about how adoption might work, because so that what you're describing there is known in kind of academic economics jargon. That's spontaneous dollarization, right? And the fact that that even can happen, like you don't really need to worry about it. If you're interested in it, you can look into exactly how it happens and when and where and why and so on. But for the purposes of this conversation, the fact it can happen and has happened
yes,
is extremely encouraging, because that's basically what we expect will now happen with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is even better than the dollar for the same things that they're interested in.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. That makes sense. Okay, so here's a question to explore then. Let's jump forward to a future scenario where fiat broadly around the world is losing trust extremely rapidly, and adoption of, let's just say, cryptocurrency rather than Bitcoin in general. Let's just say cryptocurrency in general is beginning to become far more used. And beginning to become the primary source of commerce. What do governments do at that point? Because their entire system is built upon fiat. How they tax, how they how they spend, how they borrow, all of that is built on the fiat system. Now, obviously, there's some governments that are already in the process of bringing in Bitcoin storage and things like that. So, for example, the U.S. Treasury has just set up, and they're buying Bitcoin as a storage in currency as well. So what is your take on what happens at that inflection point as that starts to take place? What actually happens then?
In entirely general terms, like by far the simplest answer, before then going into some maybe more interesting specifics, is just they do what they did for all of human history prior to the early 20th century and then accelerating through the 20th century, which is that they either have a balanced budget, or they even that probably I don't think is very likely, because you had pretty considerable floated public debt even on the gold standard, which like worked just fine. Like I'm not I don't mean this against you per se, because I know why you're asking. I know the topic we're getting into, but there are people who will ask very similar things and as if it's like a gotcha, right? It's like, well, like it won't ever work. It's like, well, yes, it will. It worked forever until, depending on which starting point you like the most. Like you can pick what happened in 1914, you can pick what happened in 1946, you can pick what happened in 1971, but across that stretch, this classical system of essentially the only way that government had ever been funded, and society didn't collapse. You could even make, I don't want to go into this now, but you could even make an argument that a lot of things worked a lot better then. That's what we go back to. That's fine. So that doesn't really worry me. The more specific details I think are quite interesting, and that I like that you framed it not as what will happen in general, but what will governments do specifically, because I find it very hard to believe that most currently dominant states will in fact accept Bitcoin. I think it will be like El Salvador, you've seen already, but more, I don't want to say rogue states. It's not like, I don't think it's fair to call El Salvador a rogue state, but more smaller, faster moving states may adopt Bitcoin in a more kind of fundamental sense. I think what the US, for example, various European governments are more likely to do is try to almost reverse engineer a moving their fiat back onto not a gold standard this time, but in fact a Bitcoin standard. And I think the reason that they will do that is they'll probably go through phases of like capital controls and
Yeah.
massive devaluations first.
Yes.
But I think the key framing to keep in mind here, I should credit, I'm sure I don't know if your audience will know, but a guy called Balaji Srinivasan. He's well known for a whole bunch of other things, but on Bitcoin in particular, he popularized this meme of like, now this is the first time there's actually been competition to fiat currencies. So in some sense, every fiat currency has competed against the dollar over the fiat regime. So again, you can pinpoint that, 1914 across the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Certainly after 1971, every fiat currency has kind of competed against the dollar, but there's weird political entanglements that make it not really pure competition. And the dollars had no competition at all. Now they all have competition with Bitcoin, and they're gonna resist it at first. But hence back to your like, are they gonna try to ban it? Are they gonna? I don't think they can succeed in actually stopping people using it. They can cut off, on and off ramps. They can do capital controls. They will do all kinds of these things. But back to what I mentioned a few minutes ago, knowing how dollarization, in particular spontaneous dollarization, plays out is very, very encouraging in suggesting that in the long run, these will all very likely fail, especially because actually Bitcoin is significantly more, again, decentralized, without really being too specific about what I mean by that, than the dollar is that enabled those processes. So the situation they're going to end up with is basically they're going to try to compete, or well, not even really compete. They're going to try to avoid having to compete and do all kinds of dirty, sneaky tricks.
Yes.
Eventually, they'll just capitulate, and they'll have to, in some or other way, peg the value of their fiat to Bitcoin. I think. Again,
okay, so that's interesting. So what you're I like that. So what you're almost saying is that for the average person, the dollar won't disappear. It will just stop being.
I highly doubt it's going to disappear anytime soon.
Yeah, but it'll just stop being. Well, I mean, the current fiat system is based on very little of any real intrinsic value underneath it. It's all based almost purely on faith, isn't it? But when it used to be on the gold standard, it moved back to say a Bitcoin standard, and so therefore people will still keep using dollars in their day-to-day life, but it will be Bitcoin backed instead.
Actually, sorry, no. I think a lot of people will, but the option of using Bitcoin will be very tantalizing, because you can imagine even at like the ground level of just individuals who know each other in some community, seeing that, wait, that guy always uses Bitcoin and he has way more now. Like his money isn't losing value. What's up with that?
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, I suppose what I'm thinking about there is more cash, because people, there's a big fear, especially among those of us who are more based than others, about the loss of cash, because I think that a lot of people understand that as long as your currency is basically provided by the central banking system, and your bank account is digital and it's plugged into the central banking system and so on, the government, whenever they decide they want to, can effectively freeze your assets, and there's all sorts of things that could happen. And so cash is therefore your only option outside of things like that. So I suppose the Bitcoin becoming, or a cryptocurrency, if something takes over from Bitcoin at some point, becoming the underpinning of that, say like gold it was in when you started using paper money instead. It would effectively be the paper money that sits on top of Bitcoin rather than the paper money that sits on top of gold, for sake of argument. Do you expect cash to continue to be a thing, or would you expect that in the future? Do you think cash is going to go away?
Honestly, I have no idea. I don't think that really has anything to do with Bitcoin. I think that's more of like a broader political consideration that I don't claim any expertise in. The way I'll tie it back, though, which I think is super interesting, is a while ago we mentioned the fact that there's a supply cap. Like that is, I think that was my answer to basically what makes Bitcoin better money. Like, why should people believe the value will go up?
Because unlike the dollar, they don't just print more of it when they need it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that is by far the most important characteristic. If Bitcoin didn't have that, it would be probably pointless. Probably. There's an interesting debate to be had there. However, money has other desirable properties rather than just storing value. And so to your point about the merits of cash, potentially good qualities of money include censorship resistance and privacy. And Bitcoin is, we probably don't have time to go into the technical nuances here, but Bitcoin is essentially perfectly censorship resistant. It doesn't have great privacy, but on the one hand, this is back to the point about Bitcoin's changing all the time. There are proposals that may never happen. If they do happen, it'll probably take a long time to come in, but ways of making it more private, which are exciting, which is a reason to, be excited in general by the fact that it's changing. That's typically the changes are always in this kind of direction. It's just to make some or other aspect of it better money than it is currently, like even better than it is currently. So on the one hand, its privacy is steadily improving, but on the other, it's significantly more private than any fiat other than cash. So that's yet another reason, back to my imagining of exactly how would adoption work, that you have a lot of people, whether it's a merchant offering goods and services, or it's somebody actually offering their labor to an employer who demands Bitcoin for this reason. It doesn't just need to be the value reason. It could be, I actually I don't want and it's kind of tricky because it's into this sort of like, what would you call it? This kind of state psyop of like, well, but what do you have to hide? Like, why would people get sick of that after a while. Eventually they click, they take the red pill basically. Like, no, screw you. I don't want you surveilling everything I ever do. And even that could be a reason to accept Bitcoin. It may at some point have very little to do with the value. It may be like, I just want money that I actually control.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I think that is probably a very good point at which to end it. So thank you very much, Allan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been a great chat.
No, thank you. What